Greetings, it is I, David Stewart. Today we're going to talk about swords, and actually one particular kind of sword. In case you couldn't guess from that little intro image there, we're going to talk about the katana. And what I wanted to address is actually sort of two different camps that sort of are in opposition to each other on the katana. Before I begin this conversation, let me say, first of all, you can find most of this information in an article I wrote a while back on the katana called The Katana, the Ultimate Weapon, and a question mark, and the link for that will be down below. But I wanted to make some more video content on it. Just a little bit of background. I'm an author. I wrote a book which features the katana heavily. It's called Muromachi Blood Drinker, so if you're into katanas, you might like it. It takes place in feudal Japan, specifically the Muromachi period. 1511 is the year of this story, and which also puts it in the Sengoku period, by the way, depending on what sort of historical naming convention you're using. Otherwise known as the Warring States period. Really, really interesting historical period, and I really, really enjoyed setting my story in it. And I got to know a lot about the katana through the research and through the writing of this book. And I got to have what I would consider a pretty good understanding of the context of how the weapon was used. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, because what we have are sort of two opposing camps. One side is like the katana cultists that think the katana is the ultimate weapon, can cut through other swords, cut through my grandpa's machine gun barrel in Okinawa. It's the greatest thing ever. The reason that its form didn't change for so long is that it was perfect in the year like 1300, and there was no reason to change it. It was already perfect. It had the best steel, blah, blah, blah. You've probably heard some people that are really, really obsessed with the katana talk about the form of the weapon like that. On the other side, you have like the anti-katana cultists that think that the katana as a weapon, not only is it like overrated, it's not just overrated, it sucks, that it's actually bad. And I remember this Lindy Beige video from years ago. Might be his most popular video still, on the katana, where he basically bashes the weapon for quite a bit of time, and sort of lays waste to this perspective that it's the ultimate weapon. But I wanted to give you sort of what I think is a more balanced perspective and an appreciation of the weapon for what it was actually used for. Because I think a lot of people make mistakes and assume that it was used for context and used in places and other than it was primarily intended to be used. So the truth is there is no ultimate weapon. Weapons have different forms throughout different cultures based on a bunch of different factors. What kind of armor people were wearing, what materials were available to make it, what manufacturing methods were available to make the weapon, what sort of other weapons you were looking to counter in warfare or in civilian life. All these sort of things can make the context of the weapon see useful. And in some cases, it's the culture surrounding the weapon, which is definitely the case with the katana. And if you think that it's weird that the culture would sort of enshrine or pay special attention to the form of a sword, think of the small sword in the 18th century. The small sword is not better than a rapier, but it became, dueling with the small sword became its own sort of cultural apparatus that propagated the form of the small sword in Europe. And so the form of the katana is also propagated in Japan with a lot of those same cultural idioms, and you have to be aware of that as well. It doesn't mean that that the cultural sort of view of the weapon is bad. It just means that contributed to the context of it. So, does the katana actually suck if it's not the ultimate weapon? The answer is no. It's actually very, very good at some things, and you can look up plenty of YouTube videos to figure some of those things out. The main thing you're going to hear about the katana's quality is that it's really, really good at cutting stuff. So you'll see a lot of cutting demonstrations, people cutting through wet rolled newspaper, people cutting through tatami mats and that sort of thing if you want to spend some money on the tatami mats. Rolled newspaper works pretty good, and it's way cheaper. To demonstrate the cutting power of a katana, they're pretty good at cutting, but most curved swords are good at cutting, as you would figure. Now, why is that? And I want to talk about why that is. So I'm not going to pull out a real katana. Not because I'm worried about demonetization or something like that, but because I just don't have one available right now. This is one of the foam swords I used to play swords with my son. Yes, we play swords. We fence in our playroom, and I like this because I can just make it as curved or as straight as I want to. And if you have a curved sword, and you imagine why a curved sword is good at cutting, it's really good at chopping, because cutting is something different. Cutting is going to be this, and it's good at cutting too, but it's also really good at chopping because if you imagine a curved object coming into contact with your arm, say your arm is curved, the object is curved, the focus of most of that force of the swing is concentrated into a smaller area of the blade, which grows as you're cutting. Whereas if you have a straight sword, here's a nice straight one, right? Sort of straight. You have a wider area that's going to be contacting the skin or contacting the armor, which in turn is going to spread that force out and make it not chop as deep with the initial attack. That's why an axe is shaped the way it is. We don't have straight axe blades, we have curved axe blades, because the idea is when you're chopping wood or you're chopping a human with a battle axe, you want that force focused into a small area to penetrate and cut through whatever you're trying to cut as efficiently as possible. So does a curved katana really cut well? The answer is yeah, it cuts pretty darn well from my experiences with not just with the katana, but pretty much any curved sword. Sabers cut pretty well as well. They cut pretty good as well, I should say. So yes, it's good at that. Now the thing is that usually there's one context. It's good at something. It's good at cutting. Does that mean you can't stab with it? No, you can still stab with it, but it's not going to be as good at stabbing as a straight sword where you can really focus your energy straight into an object with your arm. This one, in order for me to focus my energy, it's going to be always coming at some kind of angle to get to you, like to cut into you. So it's not as good at thrusting, but it doesn't mean it's useless at thrusting. And the katana actually has a fairly gentle curve, which makes it sort of modest between those two extremes. It's good at cutting, but it can still thrust, and you usually have quite a sharp defined point on a katana, but it's not a long sword, right? Or it's not a medieval arming sword, or really a long sword. A long sword has a very nice defined point, and it's not a rapier with that's really, really narrow and pointy and designed to really get stuck in there. So you have to think about those two extremes. At the same time, is a straight sword bad at cutting? The answer is no, it's not bad at cutting. It's nice and sharp. If you imagine this is nice and sharp, it's nice and sharp, it's going to cut. It's going to cut pretty well, but you're not concentrating as much force into a small area. So it's really, you're dealing with trade-offs. The other thing is, if you think about like a European longsword, or a bastard sword, a hand-and-a-half sword, these sort of late medieval swords that have this really, really brutal point on the end, they were used in the context of lots of armor being used in the battlefield. And that extra sharp point, you could get it into like get it into somebody's armpit where there was a gap in their plates if you're working against plate armor, or if you're working with mail, it could pop apart some of those mail links and get through the jack. You usually wear padded jack still underneath it. Get through the jack and get into the skin and cause a wound to somebody. So if you had a curved sword that was really good at cutting against most armor, including chainmail, it's not going to be very effective. You really want that nice point there. And so that's where a lot of the European armaments went, because they had very, very robust armor. Does that mean the Japanese didn't have robust armor? Well, let's take a look at that picture again. No, there's a bunch of guys with armor. But what you should also notice is there's guys without armor. The fact is that there was samurai armor. Was it effective? The answer is yeah, it was actually pretty effective, and it was pretty effective against cuts as well. So it was really, really protected you against cuts. That doesn't mean you couldn't give point with a katana. It just means the armor was good. Now, did everyone afford armor in feudal Japan that happened to be samurai? And the answer is no. Not everyone could afford a suit of armor. It was quite expensive. In late medieval Europe, a full suit of plate armor was considered very, very expensive, and it's unlikely that all knights happened to own a full plate set of armor. More likely you had a mixture of plates and mail or whatever was effective, and mail is actually really, really effective armor. They used mail in Asia as well. It's not purely a European form of armor. It's really, really effective against slashing cuts and chopping cuts. The other thing is, like, by the way, just if you have a male shirt on and somebody chops at you with a sword and you're like, ha, I'll be protected. And then you're like, ouch, my collarbone broke. Yeah, there's still a lot of force in the swing of a metal object that can do things like break bones, just as a by the way. So in the context of armor, you have armor that's really effective against a katana. So why didn't the katana end up being developed into like a really nice straight weapon where we could really get into the gaps of the armor and pierce people? Well, the answer is because in reality, the katana wasn't really used in the context of a full battle, in the context of war, as a primary weapon. And this is actually true of European swords as well. They have something in common there. The katana was really a sidearm, and if you were a samurai, you wore two swords, and the katana was one of them. The other one would be either a tanto, which is a dagger, or a wakizashi, which is a somewhere you could think of it as like a short sword, or splitting the difference between a dagger and a short sword, depending on the length. All the lengths vary wildly, and there's not like a particular standard where tanto ends here and wakizashi begins here. It's just an idea, an idea of classifications. So you had those two swords were a symbol of your rank. That's part of the culture. I'll talk about that in a second. But you wore that everywhere. So you wore your katana everywhere because it was the symbol of your class, called samurai. And you wore those two swords were called a daisho, were the symbol of your class. So you wore them everywhere. Did you wear armor everywhere? And even if you owned a set of armor in feudal Japan, chances are you weren't going to wear that armor everywhere. You'd probably wear the armor if you were expecting trouble. So if you were going into battle, or if you were expecting a fight for some reason, you might wear the armor. Why wouldn't you wear armor all the time? Well, it's really hot. And Japan in summer is really hot and humid. And so you wouldn't want to be wearing all kinds of thick padded clothing. You wouldn't want to be wearing a big padded linen jacket and then a bunch of plates of steel on top of yourself and walk around like that. That'd be extremely miserable. And so because that's the general thing, people were not walking around with armor. Having a sword that cuts is really good. That's advantageous because you're not having to worry too much about your opponent wearing mail or something like that, which means the chop is going to be nice and effective. And so there'd be no reason to develop a straighter sword. The primary war weapons, rather than being the katana, which was really your sort of your sidearm, your weapon for when your primary weapon wasn't available. Primary weapons were the bow and the spear. And there's different words for the spear in Japanese. Yari, I think, is just a general term for spear. But the naginata, which was a single-edged spear that could cut and thrust, was very, very popular weapon. Why is a spear... Now, this is true in the European theater as well. The spear is a superior weapon to a sword in virtually any context in which it could be used outside of like an enclosed area where you can't use its main advantage. And its main advantage is length. Because a long spear, if you have a 6-7 foot spear, that means you can offend your opponent 5, 6, 7 feet away before they're close enough to offend you, which means that you're able to kill him without him having as much a chance of killing you if he doesn't happen to have a spear. A spear is also quicker than a sword, and people are going to be like, no. A spear is a big, heavy thing. It can't be quicker than a sword, but you have to think about how fast the offending tip moves, and if you've ever played with a spear and seen how fast that tip can move around, it can move around really fast, and you can strike very, very fast with a spear as well. So the spear is, generally speaking, a superior weapon for war because it lets you offend your opponent at a longer distance, and it's also quicker and more difficult to avoid and can be used in the case of the naginata, the Japanese spear. It can be used both to cut and to thrust. So you could use it to offend somebody who had armor or somebody who didn't have armor on. It worked pretty well for both of those. But if your spear got damaged or you dropped your spear for some reason, then you would have your sword to fall back on, and your sword would still be effective. Even if if you had an armored opponent who had armor that was effective against cuts, you could still give point on that, and you could still cut in any sort of vulnerable area that he happened to have on his armor and still make use of that katana. It didn't become useless because it was very good at cutting. You could still give your point to it, and it would still work pretty well. The other main weapon of war was the bow, and the bow lets you offend your opponent at an even greater distance. You can launch a missile at them and have no risk of them being able to hit you with their club or their spear or whatever it is. So those were the two main weapons of the samurai. And indeed, a lot of samurai were mounted. So you had a third possible weapon before you would use your katana, which is called the odachi. And that was basically a Japanese greatsword. Think of a katana on steroids, or a tachi on steroids. Longer, as long as like a claymore, good wicked curve, and you use two hands with it, and you'd use it from a mounted position to strike down from your horse at people on foot, and it was very, very effective at that as well. You couldn't really draw the sword on your own. You carried it on your back, and then you draw it, and then you'd use it. But that was another third option, which again was superior to the katana because it lets you offend your opponent at a distance. And if you're on horseback, spear is effective, bow can still be effective, and that odachi can also be effective. And your katana was really sort of your backup weapon, and then your weapon of last resort would be your wakizashi or your tanto, a dagger, so that you'd never have to be unarmed, so to speak. So that's the main thing that people have to understand about the context is like, no, the katana is not the best weapon of war, but that wasn't the case. The sword wasn't the main weapon of war in Europe either. It was always the spear there for the same reasons that the spear gave you longer reach. You can look at going all the way back to like the classical period. All the paintings in Greece are of dudes with spears. They had swords, but the spear was like that primary war weapon. And likewise, you have other cultures that have chopping weapons, like you could think of like the kopesh, which is an Egyptian and Middle Eastern weapon, and I think Hebrews also used it. It's like an axe. If you took away the axe head part, it's a big curved sword. I don't have one here to show you, but you can just Google kopesh if you want. Very, very good at cutting, but people weren't wearing a lot of armor back in the Bronze Age, back in those particular periods. So you didn't really need something that could like penetrate a heavily armored foe. So these things sort of developed together. So that's the reason that the katana, I think, is actually, it's a very, very effective weapon for what it was, but people tend to overrate the effect because of how long it persisted in history. They tend to overrate the effect because they don't think about the context in which it was used. It wasn't a primary war weapon. The other thing about the katana, besides the fact that it's like the symbol of the samurai culture, is that the form didn't change for a really, really long time, and that has to do for cultural reasons. But even then, even though two katanas may look similar, you could pick them both up and they may feel very, very different depending on their purpose. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. The main misconception has to do with the fact that people aren't thinking about how the weapon was used. A katana was used for... It was a primary weapon if you were a civilian. If you were just walking around as a samurai, you needed to be able to defend your daimyo and defend yourself and your honor at any particular time. And if you were dueling, you would duel with a sword, and that would make sense for that context as well. And those contexts are in my book, Muromachi Blood Drinker. There's duels, there's pretty much everything you have in here. But the main thing about the story is that all the fights are taking place essentially in a civilian theater. They're not taking place on the battlefield. And if I had any full battles in this particular book, because this is really centered around sort of the supernatural elements and a little bit of a mystery. If I'd had any battlefield stuff, it would have not been centered around the sword so much, and we would have seen a lot more use of spear. And indeed, the guards are usually holding spears. People tend to be using weapons besides just the katana. It's not all about this, but because it's about a cursed blade, we're going to make it about swords. There are duels with swords. Overall, I think it's pretty good. Just so you guys know, you can get this right now. I'm running a promotion on this. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, May, what's that going to be? 11th, 12th, 13th of 2017 if you're watching from the future. You can get my ebook for this for free. It's going to be free on Amazon, $0 for those 3 days only. So if you're a regular subscriber, regular viewer, and you haven't picked up the book yet, now's your opportunity to pick it up. And the only thing I would ask is that if you pick it up and you read it and you get through it, leave a review so that other consumers have an idea if this is a book that they want to read. I know that Japanese historical fiction is not the biggest genre in the world, but there's some people who are really enjoying it. And if you want to take a little toe dip into it, I like my book, and I think it's a cool place to start if you're interested in knowing about the katana. I do, by the way, describe how the katana is made, and that's something that I didn't talk about in this video. So maybe I'll finish with talking about how the katana is made, because that's sort of the last piece to understand with context, is when it's used, where it's used, and in what part of life it's used, how it's attributed culturally. The last thing is materials. I'll try to make this brief to close it out. The katana was not made out of superior steel from everything else. Yes, the steel was folded many times, but other cultures had developed pattern welded steel at the same time as the Japanese, or before the Japanese. You may hear something called Damascus steel, which is basically where you're taking several types of steel and you fold them layer upon layer, and that's sort of how a Japanese sword is made. The curvature of a katana, and indeed a curvature of like a tachi, which is an older form or just a different version of a Japanese sword. Just by the way, tachis were hung down, katanas were hung edge up. Tachi, katana, in case you're ever wondering, in case you ever had a weird, curious thing about that. The general tachi, which just means sword, was usually carried edge down. The katana was carried edge up, so that you would never damage your edge by carrying it around. Anyway, so the way that you made a katana is, Japan was actually very, very steel poor, very, very iron poor, which explains why a lot of full-blown samurai couldn't afford a suit of armor, because that's a lot of metal to go into it. And so the way that you actually had to smelt steel in Japan is really hard. You had to take iron sand, which is just this red sand of iron oxide, and you had to smelt it in a big ceramic kiln. Then you'd break open the ceramic kiln when you were done, and you'd have just mottled steel, most of it garbage, and you'd have to break that apart with hammers, and you'd get all different kinds of inconsistent versions of steel, and you'd have to have somebody who was an expert go through and sort all the steel into what's called tamahagane, which is like the good steel. And then there was the softer steel. Then there was stuff like pig iron, which wasn't good. And then there's cast iron, which had too much carbon. And if you don't know what steel is, it's a mixture of iron and carbon, basically. And stainless steel has some other stuff in it, but mainly steel is just iron and carbon. So if you ever hear someone call this a sharpened iron bar, that's what it is. It's a bar of iron with some carbon in it. You sharpen it and use it to hurt somebody. So once you have these little pieces of garbage steel, some of them are good. They're expensive to smelt, and then the way that you're going to forge them into a blade is you have to hammer them all together into one big piece of metal. And there's a couple different ways that people would actually use this to make the swords. And one of the ways that you'd make them, especially from like the Muromachi period onward, is you'd hammer all the tamahagane together in a forge, which is basically you forge weld it together into one piece of steel. Then you hammer it out flat. Then you get it hot and you fold the steel back in on itself, so it folds back in on itself, and then you hammer it out again. So you thin the layer out, and then you hammer it on again, you thin the layer out. If you ever made a croissant, it's the same thing. It's just like making a croissant or a flaky butter pastry. You put out the dough, you put the butter in it, you fold it until you end up with all these layers of butter and dough. A katana is like a croissant. So you hammer that out, you do that a bunch of times, and each time you do it, it multiplies the amount of layers. So you ever hear, oh, well, there's millions of layers. Well, if you just get out a calculator and you start multiplying 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, you get to a lot after not that many repetitions. And so once you have this steel that's been folded a bunch of times, what that does is it takes a very inconsistent steel and makes it into a consistent hardness and a consistent resiliency of steel. And then from there, what you usually do is you have that good steel, and what you do is you get the softer steel that wasn't as good, and you do more or less the same thing, and you'd wrap that good steel around this softer iron core so that your edge and your sides would be made of a harder gradeness of steel, that really fine tamahagane, and the middle would be made of a softer steel, which would give it resiliency so that the blade wouldn't shatter, because there's this relationship between hardness and brittleness. The more hard you get, the more brittle you get, and the easier it is to shatter, to break something, or to cause it to go dull immediately. And the more resilient it is, the softer it is, but the harder it is to get it to be really sharp and hard. So the idea here is a compromise. You have a soft, resilient core, and then you have wrapped around it a really, really hard layer of metal. And you could do that, or sometimes you would just make one piece, one piece. But what kind of started happening, by the Edo period certainly, is that you would do this if you really wanted to make a good piece of steel. And from there, what you do is you'd actually hammer it into a long flat bar, and you'd hammer it into the shape of a sword at the edge and everything, but it'd be a long flat bar. It'd look, flat, and you'd be like, okay, they didn't forge it into a curve. That didn't happen. What they do is they put clay on half of the blade and heat up the blade in the forge, get it really, really hot, and then they'd quench it in water. And when they quenched it in the water, that's a hardening process for steel. You ended up with what's called differential hardening, where the edge would expand slower, would expand more, and the spine would contract or would basically cool down faster to get smaller. And you'd put the straight sword into the water, and out would come a perfectly curved sword if you put the clay on correctly. Sometimes the steel would break and you'd have to start over right at the beginning, and that probably be pretty awful feeling if you were a smith to have that happen. But that's the last reason that the katana was the way it was. It's a pretty thick sword. It's a pretty heavy sword, but it's fairly resilient not because they were geniuses when it comes to folding metal or had some sort of extra precision to detail that other cultures didn't have, but because they were actually really, really mineral poor, and the katana represents the ability to make something very useful and good out of what you had available, which was honestly pretty poor steel. So that's pretty much all I'll say about that. Is the katana the ultimate weapon? No, but it's good for what it is, and a lot of people forget about the quality of it, I guess because they don't understand the full context of it, and other people deify it unnecessarily, again, not knowing the context, not realizing it wasn't the primary weapon of war in feudal Japan. So Muromachi Blood Drinker, it's out now. You can get it for free over the next 3 days. By the way, I have a new book coming out. It'll be coming out this summer. It's called The Water of Awakening. I have a whole bunch more stuff to show you with that. I'm leaving this till the end of the video to not feel too spammy about it. But if you give me an email, stu at dvspress.com or stu at davidvstewart.com. That'll be down below in the description. Send me an email with the title in the subject, book list. Send me an email with book list, and I will manually put you on my book list. I don't have links set up right now for like an email list, but I'll manually put you on that. And if you were on my list by June, you get the book for free, and you get it early, and you get the early access version, which is basically the version before I finished editing it into a final product. So you get to see the rougher version of it, and you'll also get the later versions for free as well. So if you get on that email list, you're going to get that version for free ahead of time, well before the launch. I want to encourage people to sign up for that and give them a good little reward for getting on my email list so that I can sell them more garbage, right? Or just communicate more about writing with you and have another way of reaching y'all. So have a great day. I will see you next time, and I really hope that this has been informative and fun. Please leave me your comments down below. I know that there's some guys on this channel who love HEMA the way I like it and the way I'm interested about it. I love historical armaments, not just Japanese, but all cultures, not just swords, but guns as well. I like the whole bit. So leave me your impressions down below, and I will see you next time.